Hello, Harold Pollack, and welcome back to the Glenn Show.
Glenn Loury, it's great to talk to you again.
Yeah, man, I'm really glad we're talking. Now, I think the audience should know that you and I, Harold, have been friends and colleagues and interlocutors for 25 years minimum.
We'll say 25.
Okay, now I know you don't look old enough to have been my friend for 25 years. And that amongst the things that you and I have found of interest to talk about from our respective social locations and life experiences is the topic of the day, it would seem, race in America, the unfinished business, the overhang of history, et cetera, occasioned by the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin affair, and the fact of the president's much discussed public comments on race in America, which he made in the White House recently. So I had thought that we might take this session of the Glenn Show to, in a way, take a walk down memory lane, intellectually speaking, for me and you, to re-engage around these questions. And there's so much fertile material out there to talk about that might be a useful agenda. And then I know that you also have some other things going on and reflections that you have that you'd like to speak publicly about, and I'd be happy to have that. So let's can we proceed in a conversation along those lines?
Sure. So I take it. So I take it you've. Why don't you start us off?
Well, there's so much to say. The president came out to the White House press corps and gave remarks that have been much debated and discussed, that occasioned, by my count, 4 of the Sunday talk shows this past weekend had panels, at least on people commenting, civil rights leaders coming out, politicians coming out, and talking about the problems, the sort of moral dilemma, the challenge to the country, the unfinished business, and so on, associated with race. And I don't know, maybe you could give us some of your reactions to some of this discussion. I mean, the subject matter is occasioned by the racial profiling and then killing of this young man in Florida who was apparently simply minding his own business and was suspected, apparently because of the color of his skin, his age, and his gender, followed by an armed man altercation. He ends up dead, shot in the chest. The jury acquits the assailant of any criminal liability in the case, and a firestorm of outrage and protest, demonstrations, marches in the street, so much so that even the chief executive and head of state of the United States of America, happens to be an African-American, Barack Hussein Obama, comments publicly, poignant, seemingly unscripted, though one knows there had to be some preparation behind it, and provocative and evocative commentary. And so that's quite a bit to chew on, no?
Absolutely. I must say I didn't watch very many of the Sunday talking shows. I was blessedly occupied in other pursuits during many of those conversations. But a couple of reactions. I have followed the commentary around the case. First thing to say is I'm actually much more disdainful, may be a stronger word than I usually use, but I find myself much more troubled and upset by many of the commentators than I am in a way towards Zimmerman himself. I think he's another troubled person who shouldn't have had a gun and certainly should not have been a self-appointed guardian of the community, given whatever issues were going on with him personally. I don't believe he woke up that morning with the desire to see someone dead that day. And I think it is always disturbing to me to the extent that we try to bring to a single human being's criminal adjudication such broad issues. Having said that, I think his self-appointed defenders have really behaved in a way and acted in a way which I find shows a remarkable ignorance of what's actually happening in minority communities and why people were so upset about this case and also how people think about crime and how crime affects their daily lives, both as people who might be victims of it and also as people who walk around with people afraid of them. And the experiences that President Obama, I think, relayed very eloquently and simply, and it's just a reality to anybody. And I'm sure I don't have to explain to you what he was talking about. So that's one reaction.
Yeah. Well, the Fox News crowd, the cheerleading for Zimmerman, the opportunistic seizing upon his acquittal in this conversation to express, don't you know most black people are killed by black people here? The percentage is 73%, 42%. Black violence, blah, 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 blah. And this canard, if only they would fix the black family. I mean, Moynihan had been resurrected. I heard his name mentioned on network television this weekend as the explanation for the problem. And my eyes rolled back in my head, and I said, my God, this is like deja vu all over again, like we're back in the 1980s or the 1960s or something,
Yeah, we're all slaves of the idea of a defunct philosopher. No, absolutely. I think there's a couple of points to be made there. One is there's this idea that there's some ostensibly politically correct code prevents people from acknowledging the high rate of crime among black youth, and that's just whatever political correctness may have existed at some point, maybe 25 years ago, is long past. And everyone who participates...
Now, that's the line, excuse me, Harold, just to say, that's the line that Richard Cohen took in this famous/infamous column that he wrote just after the verdict came down, in which he said, why won't we find politicians who are prepared to acknowledge the reality of black-on-black crime and the legitimacy of fearing young black men who, in the minds of an onlooker who doesn't know anything else, has a right to be afraid of them because the statistics point out. And you're just saying that is not borne out by, let you say what you're saying, but yes, that's the context in what you're saying. So Go ahead.
I think he's wrong in two ways. I think many of the commentators are wrong in two ways. First of all, youth violence may be the most talked about topic in minority communities today. I spend a lot of my time speaking to communities, working with local organizations, and in fact, I was at the Justice For Trayvon rally in Chicago, and we can talk about that a little bit. I was just there taking pictures.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
And I pull out my camera, and all of a sudden this beefy hand slams down on my shoulder, and I sort of turn to my left, and I look into the white T-shirt of one of the larger human beings around, and I hear, "Hey, Professor Pollack, how's it going?" And he's one of the guys that that works in violence prevention interventions, that I know, who's working in Englewood. And it is.
Come on, Harold. The scene is just priceless, right? I wish you had caught it on camera, right? So people may be able to tell from the video that Harold Pollack is relatively diminutive, although sturdy.
Yes, exactly.
Gentleman.
very fit. And very fit, but
I can see you being towered over by this big hulk of an African American. Looks like a bruiser. And then it turns out that he's been spending the last 15, 20 years trying to, lead youth in the right way and get them, I hear you 100% on this.
And it's you and I make a pairing that's, we're often confused with each other as well. One of the striking things, by the way, about this rally is so many of the people there, I didn't actually see too many young people who looked like Trayvon Martin, but I saw a lot of people who looked like Trayvon Martin's mom and dad. Or Trayvon Martin's big brother, and people who are quite angry about this case, and not because they themselves, they remember being profiled in the way that President Obama described, but it's not that they are personally being treated this way now, but it's that they're wondering, this is my precious child, and this is how he's going to be treated and is treated every day. Or could be treated, and that is, there's a quiet anger there. The political center of gravity in minority communities is not volatile young people or people who are making videos that get a lot of attention on Facebook or whatever. It's basically middle-aged men and women who are wondering what is the world that my child is coming into. And how is my child going to be treated? I live in a majority African-American community, and my neighbors the kids who are shooting baskets in my driveway. They're tall 17-year-old kids, and their parents are very angry. I think the second.
Let me tell you something. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry if you were not finished.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to remark on, I saw Bobby Rush, who is a member of the United States Congress representing a district in Chicago, on television this weekend in a debate with Newt Gingrich. Okay? So now, there were a couple of things interesting about this encounter. One of them was Rush, as it turns out, is a Christian minister. Okay? And in the midst of the flying of invective and controversy around the George Zimmerman acquittal, he called upon conservatives, Newt Gingrich in particular, but conservatives more generally, to not forget the teachings of their church and to identify with the struggles of people in communities like the community that he pastors in Inglewood in Chicago, which is a community I'm sure you know. And where the reality of the violence that the Fox News crowd are crowing about on behalf of George Zimmerman, that is the black on black and the inner city violence and the gang violence and whatnot, is playing itself out in the lives of his parishioners. Yeah. Undoubtedly, he's preaching funerals. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's somehow the idea that he's somehow unaware that there's a high rate of crime.
Exactly. No, this is exactly what I'm saying. To say that he's got his head in the sand, that he's politically correct, that he's a hush-hush, don't talk about it, that's completely ridiculous. He's grappling with it every day, and he's calling for help. He's saying, help us. He's saying, government,
by the way, I think
incorporate these people.
If I could just cut in, there's two things, by the way. I was just watching Bill O'Reilly was giving one of his talking points, and he said, when's the last time you saw a public service announcement telling young women, not to get pregnant as teenagers? I'm just thinking, the L in Chicago is plastered with those, and every you walk around and
the last time
what's that?
The last time I heard that was last Sunday.
Yeah, any church in the African American community, basically ever. The idea that we need to present a message of uplift and discipline and avoiding various sinful behaviors. People probably heard that once or twice before. Now, I think
this point is so.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, hold on, Harold. This point is really important. I think the point here is really important. So we have a society that's riven by all manner of division. We also have huge social problems that manifest themselves in various quarters of this society. Race is a factor in that. So ghetto poverty, violence in the inner cities, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is a real thing, and it's a real problem. People are afraid. There's inequality. There are questions of social policy and what to do. There are questions of justice, punishment, who do you hold accountable, and so forth and so on. Okay, so now a conversation is going on, and I say Fox News as a kind of, metaphor or hook for the general polarization of that conversation, and who's responsible and who's accountable, okay? And so then people will say, the black family has failed. There's violence in the inner cities, and we can't talk about it, blah, 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 blah. And they act as if, the people who live with the consequences of this profound social failure are not themselves deeply engaged with it, are not themselves morally accountable, are not suffering, and deserve nothing but our support and our sympathy, okay? Instead, they're characterized as sticking their heads in the sand while the problem festers around them, and why won't they own up to the problems of the black family? Okay, so here's the deal, okay? At the bottom of society, where the excreta that are produced by large structures that produce social inequality manifest themselves, at the bottom, amongst the desperate people, amongst the people who don't have any alternatives and have no place else to go. There's huge pathos. There's deep and profound humanity. Do you think these people are automata? Do you think they're idiots? Recognize their humanity. They are confronting the suffering. They're burying their own children. You think they don't care? Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
The superficiality and the lack of the imputation of basic humanity to the African American community, quote unquote, in the wake of this challenge, the failure to see what they're doing, the dismissal of a guy like Bobby Rush as a, predictable lefty who shows up on the floor of the House of Representatives with a hoodie on and identifies with Trayvon Martin, and that's a 50-year-old civil rights trope that we don't have to pay attention to, when in fact, He's a guy who's lived out his entire life within communities such as this, and who is going to his grave fighting on behalf of these people.
Well, I would say...
fighting without much prospect of success. Okay, I'm finished with the rant, but you see where I'm going with this.
I see exactly where you're going. And by the way, I think one of the sad aspects of many African-American elected officials are flawed messengers for a critical message that they are desperately trying to deliver, and they're desperately trying to convey a message that needs to be conveyed. Bobby Rush is certainly imperfect as many others.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. Okay. And by the way, people should know that Bobby Rush beat out President Obama in some congressional primary some years ago. Is that not correct?
He takes great pride in that.
And played the race card big time in doing it.
He took great pride in that, and still does, and reminds people of it in every way, and every day in every way. And I think it's easy to dismiss the gravity of what people are saying. In fact, I was just looking at the same Bill O'Reilly talking points memo. He said, let me just get this quote right because it's on point. He said, let's just hold on 1 second. Our viewers will have to. Says many Black Americans harbor at least some resentment for past injury, which is quite a remarkable way to put things, given what's going on. Now, I do think there's some other things, though, to get to in that. So one is that people are very well aware of this problem. Two is that they talk about this problem in a different way than many other Americans do. Partly because they are forced to confront the humanity of people on both sides of the criminal transaction. And they are burying their children, but some of their other children are also the people who are going to jail and who are facing the consequences of the criminal justice system, and who are not just involved in crime, but whose lives are diminished in many other ways that people see. And I think I think many people, Bobby Rush and many others, insist that we have to deal with this problem in a way that is that acknowledges the humanity of everyone there. It's not. There are plenty of kids born in Winnetka who are prone to aggression, who, given the right circumstances, might be pulling the trigger in some counterfactual life, taking someone else's life, and because they are properly nurtured and supported, that's not going to happen. And if they do commit a crime, they're much more likely than a kid in Englewood to avoid the crushing consequences of that and to see their lives permanently altered by involvement in the criminal justice system. Every upper middle class person that I know has some young male relative who's gotten somehow in trouble and had a scare in their life, and usually that moment passes and that person eventually rights themselves, and we just never talk about it anymore, whatever that incident when they were 17. And
Can I comment?
Yes.
No, I want to tell just a little personal story, because it's within race as well as across races that this distinction that you're making between those who, if they step wrong or have a wrong inclination, have sufficient supports not to end up, in the jail for 25 years, and those who do not. So in my own little history, I, as a 16-year-old kid with a pretty good support system of aspiring, working to near middle class family members in Chicago, stole a car. Okay, I walked onto the lot of a service station, found a vehicle which one could start without the key, started it and drove it off of that lot because it was a lark for me. I was 16 years old and I just wanted to drive that car without a license or any warrant. I was stopped by the police and arrested for car theft, okay? And I was 16 years old in Chicago, brilliant kid at the high school, on my way to a technical institute and blah, 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 with an uncle who had been an assistant state's attorney early in his career and knew everybody in the courthouse and blah, blah, blah. And when I was taken to the police station and they were interrogating me about, who you're working with and where do they sell the parts and blah, 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 my uncle walks in and he says, "Come on, this is a decent kid who just stepped wrong. I mean, for crying out loud." Okay, I didn't get off. I had to go to court. I ended up with a suspended sentence, and if you don't get into trouble, whatever. And I survived it and became Professor Loury. But truth of the matter is that if I had been slightly to the low side of the social calculus, the story on my own personal biography could have been very, very different.
Wow, that's some story. By the way, I have a cousin who now deceased who was caught in a burglary. And when the store owner found out that he was a Jewish kid from the neighborhood, basically dropped the charges. And I think something somewhat similar occurred in his case as well. And we all know of cases like that. I hope the court's not watching your blogging heads. You might, I don't know what the deal is with them unsealing that record and going after you, but hopefully they'll forgive you for whatever conversational sins you might have committed.
Here's a quick Homeland Security story. So once I was invited to a conference in Canada. So I'm crossing the border in New York. I flew into like Syracuse or someplace and rented a car and I was driving. So the border security, and I'm crossing, this is after 2001, I'm crossing into Canada. They go to a computer. They have me get out of my vehicle. I come inside. They go to a computer. They find this thing.
Oh, man.
I'm talking 1966, Harold. I'm talking 1966. I'm not kidding. They find this thing, and they almost don't let me into the country.
Wow. The funny thing is that when I lost your phone number, I actually called NSA, and they were able to get it for me. So there are some upsides. But let me get to another point about profiling. Also, I want to get back to something because there's this Richard Cohen piece. One of the there's a number of difficult issues in the profiling debate which we can talk about, but there's a level of basic stupidity in the argument that he was making, and I'll give you two reasons why I think it's stupid. One is people are much safer. Most of us are much safer than we realize. And Chicago is a pretty tough town. The homicide rate among non-Hispanic whites here is 3 per 100,000 per year.
And you should put that in context. How does that compare to? That's low, but how low is low?
Well, that's basically what the homicide rates are. It's a little bit higher than the homicide rates in if you went to a Western European city and depending which city you were in. But I mean, we are basically living in a pretty safe environment in terms of our personal safety from homicide. Now, that's not the same as someone snatching your iPhone or any number of things that can happen to you. Even there, we're actually at Western European levels pretty much. And I've been working for 20 years in low-income minority communities doing public health work, and I've had some scary moments. I have not had, no one has put an unkind hand on me for 20 years. And
you've been going out of your way to expose yourself to the depredations of the inner city.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, we do not live, I went to Cali, Colombia, where the homicide rate is now 4 or 5 times what it is in Chicago. And, that's a really dangerous place. And, we really had, I know you've been to Bogota, which is not the same, but has some of the same issues. When you're worried that if you get in a cab that they're going to kidnap you and things like that. That's really
right.
And so, I live in a neighborhood that's majority African American. It's filled with kids who are basically taller and stronger than I am. They're the classmates of my kids at school, and the people are walking around with a level of fear that is really strange. Trayvon Martin was standing there at 7:00 at night. Eating Skittles. And he seems to pose, the idea that young black men pose this kind of existential threat of extreme violence is not borne out at all. And it's true that young black youth are much more likely to be arrested, much more likely to be involved in crime and violence than young white youth. And that's a really serious problem that we should not in any way diminish. But the idea that one should be walking around with the idea that the nearest black kid is going to attack me or something like that is insane. And I think that that this profiling debate is just completely out of whack with my everyday experience about what it's like to move around in a big city and to just live among different kinds of people. I don't know if...
Okay, so here's the pushback. Here's the Michael Bloomberg, Ray Kelly pushback. The crime rates have gone down, and the rates of violence have gone down in places like New York City because we are racially profiling. And the victims of these depredations are more often than not residents of these communities, African Americans themselves. So the effect of the profiling, and even if we grant you that it may be to some degree overestimating the threat, has been to secure greater public safety for the least among us. What's your problem with that?
I'm going to surprise you actually with what I'm about to say, I think, which is I have a somewhat moderate view about aggressive policing when it comes to the issue of guns. I think there's actually, I was speaking of George Zimmerman and Richard Cohen's paranoia about...
Got it.
I think that we have to, there's certain kinds of...
I mean, just to be clear. Go ahead. No, I just want to be clear. You're saying there is something to be said for police tactics that have the effect of reducing the number of guns in the hands of these kids.
So, I mean, I think right now what we have in Chicago, and, Chicago, CPD recovers more guns than the LAPD and the NYPD combined. So, we have...
Wow, I didn't know
we have
that.
a huge problem. And, if you say the basic recipe for homicide is a couple of young guys getting into it plus a gun equals a dead body, that plus gun part is just where we got a real problem with that. So if there's a corner where there's been some gang activity and there's a couple of guys standing around for no obvious reason at 10:30 at night and cops come by and say, hey, we want to talk to you and we want to just make sure you're not carrying a gun, I think that there's a role for aggressive policing, in this gun area. Now, what happens? How those young people are treated? There's a lot that I'm leaving unspecified in that. But I think that police need to be able to do their jobs in the places where there's a lot of crime and violence. And I think that it's a complex issue. It's a little bit more complex on both sides than people really are discussing, because I think that there's
So I just want to ask you. I'm just trying to ask you, Harold, whether or not you're endorsing stop and frisk as a morally legitimate public safety strategy.
Well, I think stop and frisk as a word is too all-encompassing to give a thumbs up or thumbs down to. The proportion of stops in which a gun is recovered or something positive is done is so low that it seems to me that's really problematic if you're stopping huge numbers of people. I hear lots of stories of just kids coming home from school who are being stopped by some cop who really knows nothing about the neighborhood or about them and is stopping them repeatedly with no justification. And I think obviously that is a problem. But I think there are certain situations where stopping and talking and sometimes frisking is appropriate. And if we put pressure on the police in a way that leads them to simply dial back what they're doing, then I think we're not going to help. Because right now the kids are arming up because they're afraid of each other, because they know all the other guys are arming up too. And we have to somehow break out of this Nash equilibrium where kids feel that they've got to walk around carrying a gun for self-protection, and then they get into some stupid beef and the gun is there. And at that point, so I don't endorse blanket racial profiling. I don't endorse heavy-handed stop and frisk, but I do endorse aggressive policing when it's done in a way that is actually focused on the gun problem, where there's actually some evidence base behind it about it, and where they're treating people a certain way. By the way, I think it's remarkable in this whole conversation how much the drug war has delegitimated aggressive policing. And you just cannot turn back the clock and say to minority communities, forget about all the stuff we're doing on drugs because now we're focused on guns. But in some ways, I wish we could do that because the guns really are the problem. And I would love to see, for example, stop and frisk. You pull out a baggie full of cocaine and you just basically throw the cocaine in the street. And you say, we'll catch you later on that because we're not here for that. We're here for the drug thing. And I think there are various reasons why they can't really do that, but I'd like, but on my wish list, I would say, it would be nice to send that message that it's just these are different issues.
This debate is full of all kinds of contradictions, it seems to me, and some of them I think are dangerous for the African American community. Let me say what I'm saying and hear how you react. It should be difficult to convict people of serious crimes. Mm-hmm. Okay? That's a protection of individuals against the awesome power of the state to deprive you of your liberty. It should be difficult. Okay? Black people have as much interest as anybody, given the disproportionate representation of blacks in incarceration, in having it be difficult for a jury of one's peers to take away 20 years of one's life. Okay? Criticism of the procedures that led to the acquittal of George Zimmerman, notwithstanding the outrageous character of the circumstance of Trayvon Martin's death and George Zimmerman's apparent exoneration, ought not to conclude with change policy so that it becomes more easy for prosecutors to get guilty verdicts in cases of this kind if you're interested in the well-being of the black community over the long run. Okay? The courts have too much power. Prosecutors find it too easy to convict. Sentences are too long.
By the way, I think the sentences are too long part.
Okay? So
I don't think the number of people in America who should get 20-year sentences, period, is pretty small. And, I would not have wanted to have seen George Zimmerman or very many other people getting a 20-year sentence. I think that's you can continue, but I'll just bracket out. I just think that sentences are way too long for a lot of people.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you about that. I mean, here's another contradiction of the gun issue. Okay, people are saying if Trayvon Martin had a gun, could he have stood his ground? The president of the United States said that. What? I don't even want to imagine a world in which Trayvon Martin had a gun.
Well,
I mean, I get the point. It's a hypothetical. It's a counterfactual trying to say that the processes of legal adjudication would have behaved differently if the races of the victim and the assailant had been switched. I understand that hypothetical. But the real issue here is George Zimmerman had a gun and he shouldn't have had it. People are saying, the NRA, where are they now? Why aren't they saying Trayvon would be alive if he could have protected himself? And that's just playing into the hands of the NRA.
Well, of course, it's a debating. Anyway. By the way, suppose Trayvon Martin had smacked George Zimmerman's head against the sidewalk and Zimmerman died. Do we, that to me is another hypothetical that it's hard to imagine that Trayvon Martin.
He would have been guilty of second-degree manslaughter. I mean, second-degree murder.
I think it would have, would have been black kid with dicey background kills local good Samaritan. And you exactly see how this thing would have played out. He probably would have. By the way, another issue is at least Zimmerman had extensive representation. If he had had a public defender, as several people have pointed out, they probably would have pled the thing out, and he'd be facing some kind of a jail term right now. And a lot of the a lot of the things that when you say it should be hard to convict people, many of the procedural protections that we have create an enormous class differential because well-off defendants can actually exploit those procedures, while the sort of urban riffraff are often forced to take what they can get. And I think many of the procedural protections are ones that are very difficult for many criminal defendants to actually use. And so I think that there's, how many people actually get in front of a jury at all? The reality is the system is processing huge numbers of people.
Excuse me for interrupting. I think you're touching on something really important. Okay, so an altercation happened in Sanford, Florida, where the vigilante community watch volunteer who is armed with a weapon racially profiles, gets out of his vehicle, follows, confronts, and we all know what happened. Okay, that kind of thing, take away the neighborhood watch and the racial ethnic difference and whatnot, but allow for the fact that some altercation comes about, whatever it is. Man, you took my parking space. I was sitting on that bar stool. What you doing looking at my girlfriend? How, whatever, okay? Happens every day, 1,000 times a day in the African-American community all around, where it's so-called, quote-unquote, black-on-black violence, which just means I got into a beef with the guy I know, okay? We're a segregated society. He happens to be black. And it ends up with some poor schmuck not dissimilar from George Zimmerman in terms of moral
and in terms of
culpability.
personal flaws, yeah.
Standing before the dock. Let me just finish the point. The point is what you just said, which is in the normal processes, the way the criminal justice system works, when this so-called black violence, so-called event occurs, which is just a schmuck with a gun in a beef, okay? He doesn't get off. He doesn't have a whole flock of people defending him. He pleads his case because he's got a public defender, and the prosecutor's armed with all kind of statutes and all kind of penalties, and he goes away for 10 to 20, period, end of statement. Sorry, I just wanted to make that point because I think you're absolutely
And by the way,
right.
and another aspect of it is I think we tend to be very focused on whether somebody's guilty or innocent. And, I mean, Zimmerman at some level was guilty. But maybe he wasn't guilty in terms of the legal, the somewhat odd legal rules that they had for Florida. A lot of these guys, they're definitely guilty. That's not the issue. And I think that we're often, like say with death penalties, we're very focused on the innocent person who is sent away or who is executed. But a lot of the really worst, a lot of the most poignant miscarriages of justice involve people who definitely are guilty, but who are treated in a way that is totally unjust and disproportionate, and in a way that we would just we would never want to see someone close to us treated. The guy was a schmuck with a gun, and he shot the other guy. There's proving beyond a reasonable doubt that he shot the other guy is not the only issue of justice involved. And I think that we have to, and that's something that I think many Americans who really don't see themselves as being on that side of the defense table don't give enough thought to. You stole the car. You did. That's just okay. We got to prove that. But that's not the end of the conversation about how a person should be treated in the criminal justice system. And I think. So now, I wanted to shift. There were a couple of things you wanted to get to in this conversation, so I thought we could shift gears a little bit. But are we?
Let's shift gears,
so
Harold.
One
You're
thing
doing
is,
fine. I wanted.
No, you go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. You go ahead. I was going to say, let's have a few words between ourselves about the president's remarks and the reactions to them and so forth. The president of the United States, the first African-American president. Race in America, Bill Clinton tried to orchestrate a conversation on race. It was maybe less than successful. The president comes out, he comes to the White House briefing room, he takes the podium, and he holds forth for some considerable period of time. He personally identifies. He says, not only might, if I had had a son, he looked like Trayvon, which he had said previously, he said, some of the stuff that's happening that people are upset about in the African-American community associated with the Trayvon Martin case has happened to me. I've been racially profiled. It's frustrating. It generates, a pain and a suspicion and a certain kind of reaction. And you need to understand the African-American community. So he spoke in personal terms. He has been both praised lavishly and criticized.
Lavishly, too. Yeah.
Viciously, one might say, for having done so. And I'm wondering what you might have to say about that.
By the way, I think I share everyone who's followed this, when you hear someone say, we need to have a conversation about race, my heart sinks with that locution. I mean, okay, let's just, the thing he did was he actually started talking about it instead of saying, let's have a conversation about it, which was much more productive. I think the fact that the President of the United States presents this issue from identifying himself with a young African-American man, there's a power to that. And there was a simple eloquence to what he said that I found quite moving. And I think that any reasonable person watching that, I think, felt, the president was just saying what it is. Now, in terms of, what is it like for every, for everyone, whether you're Barack Obama or Trayvon Martin, who is perceived as a potential threat by so many people every day, and I thought that was very powerful. Now, I think some of the sort of churlish critique on the right of what Obama said, and the idea that what he was saying was somehow inciting racial division when it was really doing quite the opposite. I think it was helpful in articulating what needed to be said in a very dignified and appropriate way. I thought that was one of those moments I was proud of the president. I do think there's a more radical critique that some people on the president's left would have liked to have seen him make of the criminal justice system that he hasn't made.
Yeah.
That's hard for him as president to do. That there is Cornel West and others are very much condemning him for not speaking out more forcefully about the high levels of incarceration among young black men and many other issues. But I think what the president said was so unobjectionable and so decent that to hear the sort of criticism of him across the in the blogosphere and on cable TV was unseemly. At least the criticism was sort of coming from his right on that. That was my take.
I want to speak to three things. I can sympathize a lot with what you were saying. One is the poignancy and power of the president's words, and the other is the churlish right-wing critique of him, and then the third is the left-wing critique. So with respect to the movement, how moving it was, so the woman who is the office manager of the economics department at Brown, who was, I believe, of Polish-American extraction or whatever, okay, she's white, says to me, I'm on the other side of the country at a retreat somewhere out west, in an email, how moved she was by what the president had to say. Okay, so this is anecdotal, but it speaks to the point of the fact that his humanity comes across in a way that I think he carried off with grace and effect. I mean, it really did touch a lot of people, and not just African Americans. So there was something moving about that. The right-wing critique. Okay, so here is what I think is a less despicable and perhaps even respectable conservative critique that I've seen, which is, the jury system is a delicate thing. You send a complex set of facts into a room with people, human beings just like me and you. We're talking about a life here, the awesome power of the state regulated by this process. A opinion or resolution comes out. The job of the chief executive officer and the presiding legal officer and the head of the government is in every possible way support and affirm the legitimacy of such renderings. That's what everything rests upon. I mean, facts are ambiguous and it's always possible to argue, but once the jury has spoken, it's spoken. What the president did by identifying in a personal way with the upset of people who are rejecting a jury's decision and saying that the jury failed us, although the president did not himself say those words, is doing exactly the opposite of what he should do as the presiding officer of the government, which is to undergird and support the legitimacy of such decisions, which will inevitably be controversial and inevitably leave people unsatisfied. I think that's a serious critique, Harold. Okay. Let me just finish by pointing to the left-wing critique, because I think there's also something serious there. I heard Cornel West on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Video blog, interview show, TV show, I guess. Interviewing Cornel West, the famed critic Tavis Smiley is also in this camp of African-American prominent, significant spokespersons who have criticized the president. And what they've said is what you said, which is that he's been president for 5 years and he's done very little about, mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow, its impact on blacks, and so forth and so on. And I think there was some bombast and some predictable overreach in that criticism, but I think there's a core of it which is valid. And the core of it is this. The president is considering appointing Ray Kelly, principal author of the New York Stop and Frisk policy, as the Secretary of Homeland Security, and his administration have allowed the press to know that. The president did go to New York City and say of Michael Bloomberg, he's a terrific mayor, quote unquote, when Michael Bloomberg has come out publicly attacking African-American activists who've been protesting against the stop and frisk. And here's the point. The point is he's president of the United States. He's head of the government. He's the guy in charge of the manacles at the federal level and in charge of the symbolic leadership of law enforcement, security, and all the rest. He's not found a way, except in personal anecdotal terms, of articulating any meaningful critique of the large structural forces of power which actually repress and produce injustice in African American communities. So what if he's been racially profiled when he went shopping when he was 22 years old? He's now 52 years old. He's president of the United States. And that just ain't good enough. And I think there's merit in that critique. End of my response. I wonder
let me give a
what
New
you think
York
about what I just said.
response. And let me also give a sort of structural response about liberals and radicals, or liberals and those further left. Yes,
Cornel West being the radical and the president of the United States
I
being
think
the
that
liberal.
Obama and Cornel West, in an interesting way, represent at one pole the incremental liberal project, and at the other end a social democratic project, which is less connected to what's politically feasible in the current moment, but keeps something going that's important. But first, on the New York front, I actually think Ray Kelly and Mayor Bloomberg have a complicated record. It's true that there's some very important questions that have to be asked about stop and frisk and profiling. It's also true that we in Chicago would absolutely, give a kidney to have the level of incarceration, the level of crime dropped to the level that they're now seeing in New York. I mean, there are fewer young black and brown men being sent away in New York City, in part because of successful public policy. And the difference in homicide rate and in violence, not just in Manhattan, but in the South Bronx and in Bensonhurst, all over the city of New York is quite something. And the ability that they've had to reduce violence is something that at least needs to be put into the ledger. And that is that's something that needs to be taken seriously to give a fair global assessment of these guys. Bloomberg's leadership on gun regulation is something that also needs to be on the table. I'm concerned about the fact that one person with so much wealth has so much political influence, but as a public health activist, Bloomberg has accomplished a lot that I admire. Now, let me speak to Obama and West. I think that President Obama is pursuing, in a basically admirable way that I'm proud of, but in a way that's very constrained, the incremental liberal project. And he's facing with Republicans in Congress and with other political adversaries a real knife fight to preserve a decent social insurance state in the United States. He's expanded health coverage, which is tremendously important for African Americans and for everyone else. And there's a lot in his record that he was able to accomplish, and many of the reasons why he has not been able to do more, reflect on his adversaries rather than on himself. So I think that the sort of completely lowering the bomb on him the way that Cornel West does is beside the point. Cornel West is, or I shouldn't say beside the point, but is incomplete. And if I don't look at Cornel West as someone who has helped bring health insurance to tens of millions of people in the way that Barack Obama has, and he's the prophetic voice on the sidelines is important, but is also limited in its ability to make people's lives better on a day-to-day basis. Now, having said that, I also think that that West is raising. West needs to be taken seriously for domestically and in his critique of the president's foreign policy. That there are deeper problems in America that President Obama is not addressing. So that's. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that was. No, I was going to respond by saying there are deeper problems in America than President Obama. I was going to say, the problem with the liberal. This is, you introduced this distinction, the liberal versus the radical. Okay, so Obama's a liberal reformer. West is a radical, if you will. Obama's where I put words in your mouth, but he stands outside the system and he critiques it. And the problem with the liberal position is the muddle of the liberal position, which is full of compromise and unwilling to declare bright lines of principle and then to try to defend them. And I think that actually can be a problem that undermines the effectiveness of someone like Obama, both in terms of his conventional responsibilities to conduct the office, what I thought of as the respectable right-wing critique of him just now I articulated, which was that he's in charge of the government. Jury trials always leave people unsatisfied. The role of the guy who's in charge of the government is to say stuff and act in a way that encourages and promotes acceptance of and the legitimacy of that process, rather than to contribute to its delegitimation, which is what he did. And I think there's something.
By the way, if I could just get in for a second,
if a man
what makes that complicated is when the result is only partly
okay.
legitimate in what actually occurs, and how do you respond to that? But I'm sorry. Go ahead. I interrupted you.
Okay. Should he become a cheerleader for juries, regardless of the circumstances of trials, when the results are complicated in the way that the George Zimmerman acquittal was? A person might say no. But here's where I was going with that. Where I was going was, if you have clearly articulated progressive moral principles that inform what you do, instead of what the liberal accommodationist incrementalist has to do, which is muddle his articulation of principle so as not to offend 51% of the electorate. If you have clearly articulated principle, then it becomes possible to do things like say, we may feel what we feel, but the jury has spoken and that's the end of it. George Zimmerman is guilty of the charges by a jury of his peers and he deserves to go free. It ought to be hard, not easy to convict people in this country. You can say that and still not betray your devotion to social justice and to the, incorporation of the African American community into an estate of equal citizenship and equal dignity within the country. You could do both. It would be easier for him to be the drone strike pronouncing president if he were also the rich guys on Wall Street taking all the money and getting out of town attacking president. But rather, he keeps Guantanamo open. He strikes with the drones. He defends the national security apparatus in this way and that. And he also presides over mass incarceration, at least from the federal level, he and his attorney general. And they've not articulated, all they've offered us is personal anecdote. I'm a black man. Okay, fine. First black man to stand in that position and pull the switch. First black man to order the attack. First black man to legitimate the deprivation of liberty. I mean, your personal anecdote is nothing compared to the heartfelt and effective and forceful articulation of progressive principle.
Well, there's something to that, but there's also, I think it neglects so many of the structural constraints that the president faces. For example, closing Guantanamo. That's something where Democratic senators bear much more accountability than the president does for his inability to do that. And now he's the president, but we have a legislative branch that that has acted to thwart that effort. Now he could speak out more forcefully on the important. He could move that up the dial in terms of his own priorities in a way that I'd like to see.
Harold, if I could interrupt, he could stop the force feeding of hunger strike detainees in Guantanamo. He could stop that tomorrow by executive order. We don't have to be force feeding and keeping those people alive. In effect, some say.
No, I'm very troubled by Guantanamo and the fact that the complicity that we all have as a society. Once we really felt a whiff of fear after 9/11, I think we've all known for a decade that many of the people didn't really have to be there, that they were swept up in something, and that the conditions there were not humane, and just the artifice of putting it on a piece of quasi-foreign soil is deeply offensive to our best values. So I don't know enough about the drone issue to make an educated comment. I do think that on health reform, I always liked it. The president on a few occasions took the time to state it as a basic principle that every American should needs access to affordable health insurance coverage and so on. I think we often got bogged down in minutia or claims about who was going to bend the cost curve, which was really not the fundamental reason to do universal coverage. But I think that the structures of our government are broken at some basic level, and that has wreaked havoc on the Obama presidency. And he faces an opposition that is willing to trash the full faith and credit of the United States government and the United States economy to achieve its ideologically extreme objectives. And when he's in that position, there's only so much he can do, and B, to a great extent, that what progressives have to do is to make sure that he's as successful as he can be, given these very tough circumstances. So it's very hard for us to at once support someone who very much needs to be supported in a very difficult political environment where the stakes are high, but at the same time to call him to account for some of these issues that you're raising, which are very important and legitimate issues that I agree. There needs to be a radical critique of the president, but at the same time it has to occur in a context where we're actually behind him so that he can accomplish the things that he needs to accomplish, and that he can defeat his adversaries who have a much more retrograde agenda, which they're coming close to realizing. Yeah, this is a good time to stop.
We're out of time.
I think that this has been a good conversation.
Yeah, it is a good time to stop. But you having the last word again, Harold. Yeah, it's a very good conversation. Thank you. Thanks for coming on the Glenn Show, and we'll do it again soon. Okay, take care then.